Today's topic is late season desiccation decisions, and we have three great speakers for you. Uh, Next slide. First, we have Rachel Van from North Carolina State University. Next, we have Seth Nave from the University of Minnesota. We're real excited to have Trent Irby from Mississippi State University here as well. And I'm Emma Matcham. I'll be moderating today's talk, and I'm at the University of Florida. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Rachel. And I have one last announcement. Please remember to use the Q&A for asking questions to speakers. And for those of you who are CCAs looking to get CEUs, the QR code will be one of our last slides. You can go ahead and scan that. Or if you don't use the app, there will be directions in the chat at the end of the presentation today for how to make sure that your CCA CEUs get to you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass to Rachel, who is our first speaker today. Thank you all for being here.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We're really delighted to have you with us here this afternoon, and thanks for your patience. Look like we desiccated the first link, and we've got a new link out to everybody. So thanks for your patience. So for a quick outline of this presentation, we're going to start just talking about why are we thinking about desiccation? Why is this a topic that we thought was relevant to discuss on the national level, because Science for Success is a national initiative. And then you'll hear some perspectives from across the country, me being in the Southeast, Trent in the Mid-South, and Seth in the Northern production environment about how we're thinking about this topic. We'll lean on Trent Irby to provide a lot of the previous research on best practices for desiccation. And then we'll finally just highlight some research that's being conducted across the nation by our Science for Success team on the topic of desiccation. So to kick off again, why are we thinking about desiccation? We first want to ask the individuals in the audience, if you are thinking about using a desiccant to enhance harvestability, what are the reasons that you either are using or thinking about using a desiccant, and what type of harvestability issues are you experiencing? We'll give everybody just a minute to fill this out before we start talking about what we feel are the major reasons that most of our clientele are using these products. Like we got a couple answers rolling in. We won't spend too long, but maybe another few seconds waiting for some of these answers to roll in.
And thank you to Haley for doing both the link updates and managing the polls at the same time. Super, super grateful for her leadership on the technology today.
Great. And thanks for those of you participating and providing the answers to that question. So from our perspective, here are some of the reasons we hear most frequently about desiccation. There's a lot of individuals that are using this production practice to homogenize maturity. Some of the historical reasons for using desiccants have been to terminate problematic weeds at harvest. And both of those things can improve harvest efficiency, which is another driver behind why desiccation is an increasing production practice in some regions of the US. We also want to mention a couple topics where we are getting increasing volumes of inquiries about. One is using desiccation as a mechanism to try to mitigate some of our seed quality issues, which we'll discuss in a moment. And we also get a fair amount of inquiries about the impact of using desiccation on green stem, which is a phenomenon we'll talk about in a few slides. We wanted to take a moment to talk about the soybean seed quality issues and potentially their relationship with desiccation, largely because this is a topic that came up in the first webinar in this series, so wanted to provide some additional information. So for those of you joining us from the Mid-South or the Southeast, possibly in your farming career or your career working in the agricultural industry, you've seen some beans that look somewhat similar to this photo. And these are seed quality issues that we often experience when we're growing an earlier maturing variety with an earlier planting date, an earlier maturing variety for us in North Carolina would be a maturity group 3 or 4. And that coupled with an early planting date aligns maturity when there's still high heat and can be heavy rainfall. And sometimes we can see major seed quality issues, as you see pictured here. So we spend a lot of time in the Southeast and the Mid-South trying to understand the drivers behind those seed quality issues. So here's another example of some plots that we harvested with an early planting date and an early maturing variety. So we catch subsamples out of our combine and we take them and quantify them for damage. So if you look at this picture, we would have a whole sample. We'd remove the damaged grain. We'd remove the grain with purple seed stain. You'd have a clean sample. And then we take all that information to figure out what is the seed damage level. And also we are having research plots to try to determine what are driving these issues. Desiccation has a relationship with this, which Trent will talk about in a moment. But some of the data we wanted to share was in regards to a question that came in the first webinar, and that was really about how intensity of mid-season pest management interacts with some of these seed quality issues. So if you look at this graph, on the x-axis, we have pesticide management strategy. You can see the different strategies we've looked at in our research: fungicides alone at R3, insecticides alone at R3, fungicides applied multiple times, fungicides and insecticides applied multiple times, and that compared to an untreated control. And we look at the percent of damage, which is in the red bars, versus the percent of purple seed stain, which is in the blue bars. And we've done this at 6 environments across North Carolina for 2 years. There was 3 planting dates at each environment, 3 maturity groups at each environment. We are creating many microenvironments where we might see seed quality issues. And essentially what we found was that mid-season pest management has very minimal impact on overall seed quality, no impact on seed damage, dropped purple seed stain by 1% if you were using a fungicide twice, but that really doesn't have a practical implication. And so I share this because if you can't manage seed quality issues with aggressive mid-season pest management, we know that the primary drivers are high moisture and high heat. And so really what we'll dive into this webinar is, okay, what's the role of desiccation that can play in trying to get beans out of the field more quickly so they might not interact with some of these seed quality issues. Another increasing driver behind why individuals are potentially interested in desiccation is its relationship with green stem. So green stem is not a well understood phenomenon, but if you've ever seen a picture like or a field like this picture you see here, green stem is a phenomenon when the pods and seeds are ready for harvest, but the stems remain green. And our National Science for Success team put together a document which underscores our current understanding of this phenomenon, but essentially it's related to there being too much photosynthesis in the plant and not enough zinc. And so a question we often get is, what's the relationship of desiccating at the right growth stage and green stem, which is also something that can be explored later in this webinar. We'll be dropping in the chat a link to this resource, or you could use the QR code developed by our Science for Success team to further discuss green stem. So those are some of the major drivers behind why individuals in different production regions are thinking about this production practice. Some of these are more problematic in the Southeast and the South, where Trent and I are, but we want to turn it over to Dr. Seth Nave at the University of Minnesota to make a few comments on the thoughts of the value of desiccation in the northern U.S.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'll be very brief because I think we want to get to Trent on this topic. But I just wanted to comment that there's been a lot of interest in the North. There's a lot of focus in this talk about seed quality and damage in soybeans in the South. But I think it's important to note that there's been a lot of interest in the North from a harvest stability standpoint. Farmers in the North probably have little to complain about relative to conditions that we see in the South, but yet that doesn't stop them from trying to accelerate harvest, be more efficient in the fall. So we'll come around after Trent's presentation on some of his research, and I will present just a tiny bit of data from a national study that we're conducting currently, and then I'll give some of my own personal feelings on the environmental effects north to south relative to desiccation towards the end. But without any further ado, I would like to turn it over to Trent Irby. He's the fellow that's done the bulk of the work on this and has the most data relative to some of the most challenging production environments late season. So with that, go ahead, Trent, and take it away.
Great, thank you, Seth. Good afternoon, everybody. So, one of the things I guess I'd like to start saying is that the information that I'm going to share today is not necessarily a recommendation. It's more for information purposes. And the reason I say that is that even in my own experiences in the fields that I've walked here in our state, different situations call for different products, possibly. The point was made early in the presentation about some of the reasons we do this. And I think harvest efficiency is number one, but then you couple in seed quality challenges from adverse weather conditions, and then you couple in green stem scenarios. And anytime you throw those into the mix, in addition to harvest efficiency or just trying to speed up the ability to get into the field, may warrant a different product selection. So just to give you a brief rundown, so when we talk about labeled options for use in soybeans, there's a number of options. For example, glyphosate has a harvest aid label on soybeans, but for the purposes of what we are doing in terms of trying to accelerate the senescence of the plant, these are the products that I've traditionally focused on in the previous research that I've done. So paraquat, the rates that I have listed here are the rate ranges on the label for use as harvest aids, the timing for the label, and then of course the pre-harvest intervals. So paraquat, sharpen, and sodium chlorate are the main three that actually have activity on the crop itself. So in my evaluations in the past, just to give you an idea of the rates that I've settled on, so within these ranges, paraquat, the quarter-pound active is the standard that I would use in any evaluation with it. I have done tank mixtures of paraquat plus sharpen and then paraquat plus sodium chlorate, and these would be the rates that I've used in that. And I will just point out that there are situations where paraquat and sodium chlorate tank mixed could be beneficial. So if you add those two together with the rate range and the sodium chlorate, I would stick with the 3-pound rate when it's in the tank with paraquat. But if sodium chlorate goes out by itself, I tend to lean towards the full 6-pound active rate. And then sharpen is a 1 to 2 ounce rate, and it really depends on the crop, the greenness of the crop with that one. But generally speaking, I've settled on the 1.5 ounce rate in the work that I've done. So not to just overwhelm anybody with data, but just to point out, so again, every field is different, and the natural senescence level of the crop itself is a little bit different too when you're making these situations. So this particular data set was generated from an application that we made when the crop was at R7. So we were pretty close to beginning our natural senescence when this application was made. And the take-home message is this: when you look at that percent desiccation line, that's just percent harvestability is a better way to probably word that. So the black bar or the bar on the left, and each one of those groupings would be the evaluations recorded 3 days after the application. And you see differences there. So in other words, paraquat is a much faster acting product compared to sodium chlorate by itself or sharpen by itself. However, as the crop wants to begin to senesce anyway, by the time you get out to 7 days after application, each one of these products are effective at desiccating the crop. So just to give you a visual of this, and again, remember that the graph that I just showed you was an application along the R7 growth stage, and we'll talk a little bit more about growth stages here in a few minutes. But the picture on the left, as we progress through these slides, is the picture taken 3 days after application. You see the leaves quickly crisped and fell off the plant, but you look closely, you can see the green stems that are still there. Even with paraquat, and then 7 days after application, you see a pretty fair difference in level of harvestability. and we'll just progress through these. So here's sharpen. This is just the same time frame. This is what sharpen looked like in that particular situation, and followed by sodium chlorate as well. So the next set that we'll move into, so this is a little bit different situation where the application was made. So this application was made as close to R6.5 as I could identify it. And we'll address some of these growth stage definitions here in just a moment, but we'll progress through these. This is a set of pictures from 4 days after application, basically a week, and then 2 weeks after application, where you'll see the untreated in the top left corner, and then the paraquat top right, sharpen in the lower left, and sodium chlorate in the lower right. So here's a week after, and then here's 2 weeks after. So my take-home message is showing these pictures is that the greener the crop is when the application is made, the longer it's going to take for that product to do what it needs to do. You know, and on the topic of green stem, and I'll hit on that just a bit more in a minute, that may warrant a mixture of a couple of products together to really tackle some of that stubborn green stem. So again, these are the options that have activity on the crop itself. So we're beyond managing just the weeds. We need to manage, in some cases, weeds and the crop. The bottom line, as far as time enhancement, I have seen up to 2 weeks benefit. So by benefit, I mean literally being able to put a machine in the field that much faster compared to if we had waited on the leaves to come off naturally. So the big thing, I think, and we'll move into timing here in just a minute, but looking at those applications and those pictures that were done, you know, around R7 versus R6.5, there is a fine line there, and there's been data generated. I've done some work. I know Louisiana's done a lot of work looking at application timing. There is a fine line, and there is the opportunity for yield loss if that application is made too early. So, you know, looking at product selection, so I think this is the meat of it. You know, product for the situation. So, for example, if I have a lot of green stem out there, a lot of extra green material, I think that a tank mix that includes sodium chlorate at that 3 pound per acre rate is beneficial. And the reason I say that is when you look at paraquat and sharpen, those are herbicides, right? And sodium chlorate is actually a true desiccant. So its goal in life is to withdraw moisture from whatever it contacts. So in our experience, the sodium chlorate has helped some with the green stem. So, you know, one of the challenges I think on the green stem is whether or not it's a genetic based causation of the green stem or if it's environmentally driven. Long story short, I have seen the true genetic phenomenon of green stem, and I have mixed various rates and products, and I don't think you can really take that out. But if you have an environmentally driven type green stem situation, the tank mixture with sodium chlorate does seem to help a lot. Again, base your product selection on expected weather conditions. So the example I'll give you again is sodium chlorate is a true desiccant. So here in our part of the country, if we have a hurricane in the forecast and we don't know how long it's going to take from the time the hurricane comes in to the time we will actually be able to get back in the field to harvest, sodium chlorate may not be the best choice in that situation because it is a true desiccant and might lead itself to some extra shattering potentially. Of course, cost of application is always a driving factor, and then the status of neighboring fields if that's a concern in your area. So speaking specifically on timing, and I've talked a little bit about timing there, I have some pictures to show and just to give an idea of what these look like. So in the work that we did when we targeted that R6.5 timing, just to give you the textbook definition of R6 for those that may not be familiar, that is seed completely filling the inside of that pod. So when I show people that growth stage in person, I try to cut open a pod and look for those square seed, if you will. The seed are so full inside that pod that they've turned square on the shoulders. R6.5, the time to get to that varies, but that's essentially when the seeds separate completely from that pod wall. So the thing to note is that at R6, obviously you still have a green field. At R6.5, you really still have a pretty green field. You see in this picture here, a lot of green leaves out there, but you do start to tend to see a yellowing of the pod at this growth stage. So again, the seed completely separated from the pod wall, and that natural senescence process will begin soon thereafter. So on the topic of seed quality, that's a big deal depending on where you're standing. We periodically experience issues. Here's some pictures that I took the last time that we experienced this issue. And the causation, I think we could sit here and debate the causation, but as far as its relation to desiccation goes, there's two things. One, I made a list one time of frequently asked questions that I get whenever we have harvest weather and situations where we have these quality challenges. And one of those frequently asked questions is, if I had not sprayed that harvest aid, would I have still received all of the damage? So in other words, is the harvest aid contributing to the damage? So that was I think you'll hear researchers around the country say sometimes it's very difficult to recreate a situation. So our stab at it, what we did was we took an experiment, and we did 2 planting dates so that we could try to capture a larger harvest window. So we had in our part of the world, the early planted was an April planted bean, and late was a late May planted bean. And then within those planting dates, we had various harvest timings. So we had plots that we harvested on time. We had plots that were intentionally delayed 2, 4, and 6 weeks late. And then within those, we had harvest aid treated and untreated. That way we could try to capture some weather and see what happened. Long story short, you see the main damage that we accumulated in this project was that 6-week delay in the early planted. So when we analyzed the sprayed versus unsprayed, we did not see any differences in the level of damage that occurred. So, the take-home message with that is that, again, if I hadn't sprayed the harvest day, would I have still seen that level of damage? In our research, when the substantial damage occurred, it was increased across the time frame rather than whether or not the soybean was sprayed or unsprayed. Then another frequently asked question that I get is varietal responses. And we've looked at variety trials and tried to grade seed from multiple varieties over the years when we have these weather phenomenons. And I do agree that there is a subtle difference between different varieties, but when we have these phenomenons, all varieties have some level of damage. So it seems to be, at least in my experience, that environmental conditions and time seem to be the driving factors between this. And the example I'll give you is that if we have a substantial weather event that comes in, and it seems to be, when our soybean seed are a true R6, and that seed is completely filling that pod, sometimes it feels like that seed outgrows that pod, for lack of a better way to put it, and we rupture the seam, and we have a weather event that comes through and allows moisture to get inside that pod. And then a few days later, we might see a little bit of sprouting. So when we're in those situations, the other side of the seed quality relationship with desiccation is that's when the desiccant can be a valuable tool, because you have the opportunity to terminate that crop and get it out faster before additional damage may happen. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you, Seth.
Very good, Trent. So I just wanted to make a few comments. The Science for Success team is really engaged with these challenges that we see on a national level. And this project is really well suited for looking at this more broadly, because we not only want to help folks in the South deal with the significant issues, but we know that farmers in the northern regions are using and learning from farmers in the South and trying to employ some of the techniques that they're using. So we can do studies in the North and talk to our farmers, but having studies that are co-located across the U.S. with the exact same treatments allows us to really hone in on the environmental differences that we see in the North and how we should manage our crop differently based on the region. So Sean Connolly in Wisconsin has graciously agreed to manage a large project, and we started in 2023. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but to note that we've got a number of sub-trials within this project. It looks like we had 7 states in 2023 participating. The idea here was really to create the widest range of environments and treatments across the fall harvest season as we could, to see the relative value of various desiccant products, timings, again, across these ranges of environments. So we put out a lot of planting dates and maturities, various timings, and then products as well across several studies. And you can go to the next one. So the results here from that trial from 23 were really relatively disappointing for us in the north. We did see up to 20% decline in yield when we desiccated the crop. Primarily when we did this early as early as the R6, this is when we had the greatest yield penalty, of course. We tended to see little yield penalty at R6.5. But definitely no yield advantage at either 6.5 or 7. And the larger effects were certainly with the later maturities that were pushing out towards maturity longer. And so I really, my personal view on this, and I'm going to give you my own opinion based on what I've seen and based on what I understand about the crop from kind of my northern perspective, is that, and we're going to prove, we're going to move on and do more research of this in 24. And I think we have the protocol in the next slide. So in 24, we have a much larger number of states, and we're going to basically put this out in a more thorough evaluation of these. But my gut feeling is, from a northern perspective on desiccation for our northern soybeans, is that we're really caught in a catch-22 in the north, in that we have, as long as we have green tissue in our soybeans, we tend to have the option for utilizing that in the crop to produce additional yield. So anytime we're removing green tissue, whether that's even in some cases possibly in the stems, but more so in leaf tissue, there's resources in those leaves that could be remobilized to the seed, or we could actually have a little bit of current photosynthate late in the year that could help improve seed yields. And then on the upside value of it is relatively low for us in the north, because we don't have these damaging late season environmental effects. So we don't see much value on that side. Plus, we don't advance maturity very much. So the further north we go, it appears that we're advancing maturation and harvestability to a lower extent or lesser extent as we move north. So it kind of reduces the value of these overall for us. So again, it's a real race with natural maturation, which is probably the last piece I wanted to throw out here, is that our soybeans in the north are really pushed to maturity really heavily by cold nights, reducing day lengths. And so when we're putting products out at the end to enhance maturation and push maturity and harvestability, we're really putting those on at a time when we're kind of racing with the environment to do the same thing. And so we see reduced efficacy of these products in the north. But we've got another year, a very thorough study going to go out this year with the Science for Success team to evaluate this in a large number of states. And so we're going to be excited to share those results with you in coming years.
Yeah, thank you all for that wonderful content. I really enjoyed your slide set, and it looks like it generated some thoughtful questions from our attendees. I'm going to go ahead and pass this first question to Trent. If the beans reach R6.5 and a big rainfall event is in the forecast, something over an inch, how would spraying then impact quality? And would it be better to spray with a good harvest forecast? So I think you touched a little bit on that interaction between timing, maturity, and rainfall, but we have kind of a specific scenario here in the Q&A.
Yeah, so that is one of the most difficult questions that I think I see, especially in those years when specifically a hurricane is forecasted, just because we don't know the duration of it. So if it's likely a rainfall event that is short-lived, for lack of a better way to put it, a normal rainfall event that's not going to extend out for days on days, then I don't think that you're going to see a tremendous difference. I don't think you run as big a risk of reducing quality from one rainfall event as you would from a multi-day event, if that makes sense. What it would do is it would speed up the maturity of the crop. So when the ground dried up and the machine could go in, you'd be ready to harvest versus waiting a few more days. On the flip side of that, if you've got a lot of days of rain forecasted with lots of rain and it's really unknown, there's times where I could argue not to spend the money, because again, you're not increasing your yield with this application. You are trying to increase your harvest efficiency and protect the yield you've already established. So I could argue not to spend the money if the rainfall is forecast to be very extended, because you just don't know the outcome of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I appreciate your distinction between kind of normal rainfall versus extended weather patterns like hurricanes and other long-term issues. We've got a question here from Joe. It looks like the work is being done in the north and the south. Is there less likely a benefit from the central corn belts, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, or should work be extended there? I'm going to pass that to Seth because he's been in contact with the team leading our upcoming trials.
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to kick the horse too much, but I think that it's likely true that the benefits are going to be lower in the north. I don't know. I don't think I'm getting ahead of myself too much there. I think I can pretty safely say that the benefits of desiccation are going to be lower the further north we go. The question is the relative value. Are we still getting something from that? And then there's an option for us in the north to use it more broadly or for specific cases, I should say. So maybe in a case of weed control later in the year and things like this. So we first need to know, are we losing yield potential by terminating a crop at R6.5? And maybe as certainly at R6 we are, but what about R6.5? And then what's the additional value of harvestability? And then we can go on to look at some of these other more specific questions if we determine that at least we don't have any yield loss in those. But I would say certainly the value of these are going to be reduced the further north we go, simply because we don't have the really tough late season conditions that can occur in the south.
Yeah, that makes
I'll just,
sense.
throw out there too, Joe, hopefully you saw the first year we did this trial. These are pretty aggressive trials for anybody that's done a desiccation work before, especially when you pull in multiple maturity groups. We had a pretty small subset of states that first year, but hopefully you've seen there is an expanded list of states participating in 2024, and some of those central Midwest states that you mentioned are participating in the study. So I do think that the data set is expanding to capture a wider range of environments.
Yeah, we do have a wider range of the Corn Belt covered in 2024. Trent, would you mind speculating, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot, about whether the folks in, central Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, if they're looking for information for this year before we have results from our trials in the Corn Belt, would you recommend that they look further south to their neighbors in Kentucky and the Mid-South, or should they look towards the north, where we have some data coming out of Wisconsin and Minnesota from 2023? Which do you think might be more helpful for our neighbors in the Corn Belt?
I mean, I'm always a fan of as local a data set as I can find, for sure. I would expect. I think I would agree. Just what I know, again, I would agree with Seth on the utility of it, because, and the way I'll answer that is, even here, if you ask me, should every acre in Mississippi be desiccated, my answer is no. It doesn't have to be. We can still allow the crop to dry down like it needs to. But what it is a useful tool when we have challenges or expected challenges to come. So I don't know if that answers your question specifically or not, but that's my take on it.
It was a wonderful classic extension. It depends, and I appreciate it. So looking for the data set that's closest to you geographically, or that is most reflective of the environmental challenges that you expect to face that year, for those of you that are looking for data for this coming season. So thank you. We've got another question here about the trial specifically. So I'm gonna first pass this to Trent to talk about the data he presented and then ask that it goes to Seth after that to talk about the trials that the Science for Success team is running. So that question is from Ryan. Were you able to harvest each desiccated plot as soon as they were capable of being harvested? Or did you wait for a single harvest date for the whole trial? So first to Trent about his trials he presented data on, and then to Seth for our ongoing research.
Okay, so one of the data sets that I presented was a single application timing, just comparing products. That one was harvested all on the same day, and we waited for the 14, 15 day time span to meet the pre-harvest interval of all products within that. So that one, everything was harvested the same day. The quality one that I showed where we had the delays, we designed that experiment so that each plot could be harvested as it was designed to be. So we had plots harvested when they were supposed to be and other plots that stayed in the field for an extended period of time, and we would come back and get those harvested accordingly.
Yeah, thanks. Seth, what about the ongoing trials from the Science for Success team?
Yeah, that's it's going to be dependent on location, and just refer back again to the north where we just didn't see enough of an advancement of maturation. And I did want to state again that, some of the challenge that we get in the north is that by the time we can apply these products safely, we just don't have, we already have cool conditions. We've already reduced some of the green tissue on these plants, and they're not, we don't have good uptake of those chemistries, and we don't really have good efficacy of those products, it seems like, in many cases. So not only are we racing natural maturation, but we probably don't have very good general herbicide efficacy in those. So we just didn't see enough of an advancement of harvestability to even attempt to try to change harvest dates or try to clip those individually. I think Ryan's got a perfect question, though, and I think we need to address this as a group, is whether the folks that can see differences should be out there harvesting on those various dates. We don't have the seed quality issues in the north, so really we're down to talking about things, narrow academic topics like shrink and things like that. And I don't know if we're capable of answering those really detailed questions at this point, but we're going to give it a try anyway this year.
Yeah, and I'll just say, for those of us that are in the southeast or the mid-south, like, we know that if you're looking at desiccations, it's imperative that your treatments where desiccants were applied are harvested timely to have any influence on seed quality, which is one of the drivers of adoption. So at least in some of the environments, I'm sure Michael Plumley, who's at Clemson, who I see on here, like in our environments, we'll be harvesting as soon as we can to really get a good pulse on how it's affecting things like seed quality. And in fact, we ran the trial this year, and we have multiple harvest dates. So
Awesome, thank you. I've got another question here. Do you think there are differences in quality based on region in the US, Mid-South versus Southeast, with an early maturity group soybean? So kind of connecting these harvest issues and quality issues we're talking about today back to our first webinar with those maturity group differences. Rachel, I know you've done a lot of maturity group work before. Do you want to take the first stab at this?
sure. Thank you for the question. And yes, absolutely. I think where earlier maturing varieties are grown has a big influence on the seed quality issues that you might run into. And I think what we've determined over time that are some of the major seed quality drivers in our environment are, yes, heavy rainfall, but also high temperatures. And so what ends up happening in our environments when you're growing an earlier maturing variety, so I always like to define what that is because it's very different across the US. But for Trent and I, an early maturing variety compared to what has historically been grown in our areas might be a maturity group 3 or 4. We even have late 2s planted in North Carolina. If those are planted in April and even early May, they can be coming into physiological maturity in August. In some combinations, if you're planting really early, an early maturing variety, even late July. And that often coincides not only with heavy rainfall events, but also high temperatures. And that's where we really see the drive and seed quality declines. I think in the more northern environments, when you're producing the same genetics, first of all, generally they're often maturing later in the calendar year, even if it's the same relative maturity, and the temperatures aren't as hot. So you're not seeing the declines in seed quality issues that we see. Yes, there's moisture in both environments, but there's differences in temperature. And again, from a lot of the seed quality work that we've done in North Carolina over the past few years, we believe that that combination of temperature and moisture is a primary driver, along with genetics as well. But, you know, to the points earlier in the webinar, we've tried to look at how you can control these issues with other types of management, but it ultimately comes down to the weather you're encountering when they're coming into physiological maturity, which is very different in our different production environments across the US.
Yeah, even within a state, it can vary a lot year to year. Are you seeing any trends with certain planting dates? I know you've done a lot of work looking at maturity group and planting date interactions, and possibly with seed quality as well.
Yeah, so we, over the past 5 years, have looked at a wide range of planting dates and a wide range of maturity groups 2 through 7, and research all across the state. So it's a very large data set. And essentially what we found is a maturity group 5 or earlier, planted before mid-May, is susceptible to seed quality issues. Once you push past mid-May, we've seen a large drop off in the seed quality issues we've encountered. And it seems to be more severe for the earlier maturing varieties within that window. And then, of course, there's interactions with things like green stem if you can't get your beans harvested, and their seed quality implications. And for us, we often see green stem issues with a maturity group 4 or early 5 and those really early planting dates. So yes, there's a planting date influence for sure.
Yeah, we also see a little bit lower green stem when we can push our planting date a little later. Trent and Seth, do you have anything to add on maturity group and planting date and differences in seed quality in your regions? I know that different maturity groups and planting dates behave very differently across the US.
I mean, I'll just comment. I agree with Rachel 100%. In our experiences here, and I made the comment earlier about timing, you know, it's really an unfortunate timing to describe it. It's just the stage of development of the crop at the time of the weather event. So planting date and maturity group all go into, you know, what stage of development you're at when you reach those points of the season with peak chances of adverse weather.
Yeah, and the only thing I might add from a far north perspective is that, the application, some folks in the far north might be considering something like this with a really, if they get a delayed planting and if they have too long a maturity, they're actually being threatened by frost, right? So we have a situation where we're running out of time for that crop. So a farmer might consider desiccating that crop for some reason to get that harvest done early. And essentially what we're doing is we're replicating the frost with a chemical application. And so there probably isn't any real benefit to doing it ahead of a frost, because the frost, you might have a few more days or weeks to let that crop accrue a little bit more yield and then just be taken out by the frost. So, and I think lastly, just to, again, kick the horse again for us in the north, is removing that green tissue in the crop more or less is reducing some sort of yield potential for us, since we don't have a lot of drag or negative impacts of the environment on leaving that crop out. We're just mostly reducing the yield potential in that crop. So I think farmers in the north really need to be careful as they're applying these products late in the season.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Seth. We've had some great questions about desiccant coming in, and I have another administrative question here from Eric asking if we can include the links and info from the chat in email, since they're having trouble copying and pasting from the chat. And I know Haley is on that right now, replying to that question using the text feature in the Q&A. We will also have information coming up in the chat soon for folks who need to email in their CCA information. And we'll have the CCA slide coming up here in a minute too. Do we have any other questions from attendees about desiccation or GreenStem? I noticed we didn't have a whole lot of GreenStem specific questions coming in today. We do have time for, one or two questions if there are more in the audience.
While we're waiting, I might just mention that I think everybody on this panel would be willing to take questions directly. So if there's anybody who wants to reach out to any of us individually, and we could help supply them with those resources as well. So if there's if anybody's looking for resources after this that they weren't able to get, reach out any way you can, either through original emails or us directly. That would be fine.
And I'm actually dropping my email in the chat as well. If other panelists here want to do that too, that'd be great. We've got a question from Tom directly to Seth. In Central and North, would desiccating for GreenStem make sense?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and we're trying to answer that question. And yeah, unfortunately, it's the green stem that we see in the north is a little unpredictable, and so it's gonna take some time to really get the right and correct answer to you. I can certainly guess that it's going to be a tough challenge because we need to really preemptively get at that issue in the north, and we don't really know which fields are going to be affected until they are. So spraying a bunch of green stems out in the field that don't have any leaves on it isn't going to make a lot of sense for us. So I think we're going to have to try to figure out a way to predict green stem and then get at it earlier. And then we need to decide whether that provides us real value or not. So I think that is definitely answered to be determined for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. We first need to know where the problem will come up, and then we can figure out the best ways to manage it. We do have another question here about GreenStem ahead of desiccation apps and whether the desiccation helps. Rachel and Trent, have you seen that in your regions?
Yeah, I can start, and then I'd love Trent's perspective on this as well. But I think what often happens is desiccants go on too late after it's been realized that the green stem issue is there, like R7.5, and so it has no impact. So there's been a lot of production practice like experience that would show us like when the desiccants get on too late, they have no impact on green stem. But I will say that I have seen in the field, not through research, but anecdotally with some of the growers that I work with, when the desiccation is applied on time, if you're looking at, let's say, a strip where the desiccation was applied at R6.5 versus where there's no desiccation applied, there have been large differences in green stem. So I think that question interacts heavily with desiccation timing, but I would pitch it over to Trent for his perspective.
Yeah, I agree with Rachel. The only thing I guess that I can add is that I think it depends on the causation of the green stem. And the reason I say that is I did have an opportunity one time where I had a field that was without question a genetic cause of green stem. And every plant in the field was green, every pod was mature, and I couldn't kill it. So, it would no combination that I threw at it really had any impact on that level of green stem. Now, go back the other way and any general greenness or maybe an environmentally caused green stem, if it's applied at the right time, yes, I've seen a benefit for sure.
Awesome, thanks. We've got one more question here about default 5. Eric's saying that they're not finding Sharpen to be very effective and was wondering how accessible default 5 is across the country. Can you find it in your area, Rachel, Trent, and Seth?
It's definitely accessible in our area. And I just actually, the folks from Drexel that sell default 5 are on the call. And so I can't speak to accessibility of default nationwide, but they articulated it should be available on the nationwide level.
Yeah, same here. We use it a fair amount in our part of the world for this purpose. And so, yeah, it's accessible here.
Seth, you're muted.
Yeah, I can mention that, we use those products on a lot of canning crops in the north as well. So they're used on other crops. And so there's product certainly around the country for those other products. And then, as Trent mentioned, there is a label for soybean. So I think you have all the pieces there to be able to utilize it if that works for you.
Makes sense. I've got a question here for Trent. How does irrigation management impact soybean desiccation performance?
So, yeah, irrigation is one of those things, I guess, that may cause it to continue to stay green a little bit longer. It just works out in our part of the world, because what we've learned about irrigation is we terminate our irrigation just before the stage of development where we're ready to start thinking about applying a harvest aid. So, that was just I'm not gonna say it was a coincidence, but as we did harvest aid or desiccation research, and as we were doing irrigation initiation and termination research, that's how it worked. But if you irrigate that extra time at the end of the season, it can cause it to stay green. But again, the desiccation application still works in that scenario, and will help dry down some of that greenness, as long as it's not like a genetic type cause.
Yeah, thank you. I have two more questions, and I think these are the last two we'll have time for today. The first is in an Illinois soybean field with uneven maturity due to environmental stresses, would desiccation be of value to ensure timely harvest? And I will let whichever panelist wants to take that one, take
Well,
that first.
I'll jump in first, as I guess we'll claim
As our
Illinois-
Midwesterner.
Let's claim Illinois as a northern state here. So, I would say this research that we're doing right now is really going to help answer that question. We don't have the answers right now, but I think going back to some of the themes that you've heard, this idea really, we need to get these products, if they're going to have efficacy for us in fields, we're going to have to get them out before we have the problem really shows up really visually. So I think, cleaning up unevenness in fields after we've noticed that they're uneven isn't going to be very helpful for us. If we find that we have individual fields that are uneven every year for some reason, which is kind of unlikely in Illinois, then we might have an opportunity to use something like this. But first, we need to identify timing and value of these products, and then we can start pushing back into these kind of more real life situations, field-wide variability type questions.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have a pair of questions here as well, from someone in Pakistan asking about whether desiccation timing and product choices in Pakistan's been studied by anybody here on this call. Is that something anybody here is comfortable addressing?
Maybe, Trent, you could take this from an irrigation standpoint. I mean, we just had an irrigation standpoint question. And so if you're in a really warm, sandy environment, fully irrigated condition, you could probably, I'm assuming you could probably take care of a lot of maturation issues with withdrawing, water towards the end. Is that the case if you're in a really hot and arid dry environment?
Yeah, I would speculate so. The hotter it is, I know the faster that crop, I mean, it can change overnight, and for any of us, but especially when heat is involved and take the water away. As far as timing goes, I guess the only comment I'll make, if an application is being considered, is to ensure that the crop is mature. To Seth's point about the earlier applications and the trials last year, there's definitely room for yield loss. So, best timing should always be when the crop's mature. And of course, each product that is labeled has those use rates and those timings and pre-harvest intervals listed there on their respective labels.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, focusing on maturity group selection and water management to prevent some of those issues that you might need desiccation for.
And maybe can I chime in again? I know the panelists always love my ranting on these topics, but I would maybe try to reemphasize the point that desiccants have probably their greatest value in yield preservation and quality preservation. And the idea that a desiccant is a yield enhancer in any way should probably be pushed down the list quite a ways. And I wouldn't mind hearing from my colleagues in the South their idea on this kind of broader theme. But my argument would be that, it's best served as a way to preserve existing yield and enhance the quality of that yield, and not this idea that we can somehow generate yield from a desiccant application.
Yeah, I agree, Seth, and that's one of the things when I talk to someone who may or may not have ever used this type of management practice, the two things that I'll say is it's not required. There are situations where it's beneficial, but to always remember that the yield has already been determined. You're not adding any bushels to the acre by making this application. Like you said, it's just preservation of what's already there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We are at 2 past the hour, so I'm gonna go ahead and start our wrap up. Please follow us on X. You can find us at Soybean Science 1. And then our next slide includes some information for CCAs and the evaluation survey. The CCA QR code is here, and then Haley will drop information for CCAs in the chat for anybody who doesn't use the CCA app. Note that once you register for the CEUs, the title will populate as the title from our first webinar in this series, but the date and time and the category area for these CEUs is correct. So don't let the title on the CEUs concern you. This is the correct QR code and the correct category of CEUs for your attendance today. Also, please use the evaluation link. It helps us learn a lot more about what we can do better for our extension and communication side, and also planning content for future years and learn a bit about your research interests. With that, I'd really like to thank all of our attendees for coming today. I really appreciate you being here. I'd like to thank our speakers. Thank you for preparing such interesting material and handling such a great volume of questions. We really appreciate it. Thank you to the United Soybean Board for funding Science for Success, and the state soybean boards that supported a lot of the research we discussed today. I'd also like to thank Rachel Van, not just for being a speaker, but also for PIing the Science for Success project, being a great leader in this multi-state collaboration space. Thank you to Haley for handling all of the IT for our webinar series, herding and shepherding speakers, doing a lot of the prep work there. And thank you to Christian for doing a lot of the publicity and announcements about this event. So again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to all of you for attending. There will be recorded versions of these talks going out to registrants in the next couple days, week or two, and that will include information that was dropped in the chat. So any of those links will be available in the email going out to registrants at the end. So thank you all for being here today. And we will stay on for a little bit longer in case people need more time to do the QR links.